Thank you for all of you for being here. We're thrilled to have such a full house. And we are delighted to welcome Miranda Spivack here this evening. Miranda, thank you for joining us. Miranda is a veteran investigative journalist based in Washington, D.C., who's here to talk about government accountability, transparency, and secrecy, and what those things mean for all of us. Miranda, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor for me, actually, to be here, too. So thank you very much.
Mutual appreciation. Miranda spent 20 years as a reporter and editor at the Washington Post. In 2017, she won the National Sunshine Award from the Society of Professional Journalists for a series called State Secrets that she produced for Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. Miranda is currently freelancing for the New York Times and other outlets while she finishes up her book, Backroom Deals in Our Backyards: How Government Secrecy Harms Our Communities and the Local Heroes Fighting Back, which is set for publication in March 2025. So we're a little ahead of the game by inviting Miranda here. We might call this your pre-publication tour.
Absolutely.
So we're going to kick off some questions. You've been reporting on government transparency and secrecy for years. How did you decide which stories to include in the book? I know it's based in part on the Reveal series. What was it about these particular episodes that made them stand out for you?
So the book has it's profiles really of 5 different people from around the country whom I'm calling accidental activists, because like a lot of people, they don't get into this because they want to, they really get into this because they have to, and they have bumped into problems in their communities. One of them is about poisoned drinking water, another is toxic chemicals in firefighter gear. There's a story about dangerous roads, and I don't know if you know this, but in most states, you cannot get the information that the state has about which roads are the most dangerous in your community. There's a whole convoluted rationale for that. These stories just sort of spoke to me, mostly because I'm a journalist. It's hard to do this work when I'm a journalist and I know how to file public records requests and I know what the law is on open meetings, but most people don't have that information, and so I was very interested to see how novices really in this world would go about doing this, and what their successes and failures were, and then I thought it would be really instructive, because I think state and local government is really where people's lives are most clearly affected and where it's really palpable. That's what goes on in Washington, where I live, and God knows what's going to happen there, but that is obviously an issue, and what the Supreme Court does is obviously an issue, but I really feel more and more that what happens at the state and local level is really where you can A, have an impact, and B, you can get messed with.
I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but can you explain in a nutshell why government agencies wouldn't want people to know which roads are the most dangerous?
Well, you're being logical. So that has to do with, actually, Congress passed a law a couple of decades ago in response to state governments who were worried that they would get sued they had a list of the top 10 worst roads in their state that they wanted to apply for federal funds for, and so they know where the problems are, but they're not fixing them, and they were very worried that they would get sued for that, for negligence, which you can, it's easier now than it was a few decades ago to sue government. And so Congress passed a law that basically exempted this information from disclosure. Some states will give it out as long as you don't use it in a lawsuit, but many states will just say, well, we're not giving it out, because there might be a lawsuit. So it's all about protecting, governments that aren't living up to their job of protecting us.
That's fascinating, and we could definitely go down a rabbit hole there, but I want to make sure we have a chance to talk about so many questions I have for you this evening. There are some points that I want to make sure that we cover, so I'm going to offer a little bit of a roadmap for our conversation. I want to start with the big picture and what you're seeing across the country, then come down to the local level here in the Bay Area, and then I'm going to ask you to share some of your best tips for journalists and community members who may be trying to access public records on their own. After that, we will have an opportunity for our audience to ask their own questions. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
Okay. So you have said that there is evidence that points to secrecy in state and local government being on the rise. How do we know this, and what explains this increase?
So how do we know this is actually tricky? Because there aren't good definitive studies of this. And, part of that is that there are lots of state and local governments around the country, and so the information is diffuse and nobody's really tracking it. Starting actually with 9/11, there was a big retrenchment in government transparency at the local level. There was a lot of anxiety about, okay, the electrical grid, we're not going to be able to tell you where it is or how it works or what the map is. And that was, I think you really started to see a lot of sort of visceral reaction about national security at the local level. So from that time, just anecdotally, there's a lot of evidence and information that governments are just not living up to. Every state has a public records law, but it's not really being enforced. It's inconvenient, whatever, it's costly. And then, why? It's everything from they don't know where the information is to they haven't digitized their records, which, okay, you're in a big city here, so presumably things are a little bit more sophisticated. But,
sometimes.
Okay. But, if you go to smaller communities in California and anywhere else, there's a lot of paper documents still, and so that's a problem. And then nobody really wants to be the public records officer. It's not a career builder. So you're left with folks who maybe not that interested in the job and maybe don't really know what the law is. And then, of course, it can mask malfeasance, fraud, and incompetence. I mean, as a journalist, when my colleagues and I are always looking around and thinking they're conspiracies, my first point of view on that is you can never underestimate incompetence.
Well, one thing I want to point out to our audience and listeners, for anyone who wants to look up how responsive state governments are to records requests, I want to point them to the interactive database that you built with Muck Rock, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, students at Marquette University's Diedrich College of Communication, and Reveal for Your State Secrets series. As far as we know, the original version exists online in a couple of places, and the one that Muck Rock keeps updated is located at muckrock.com/place, if anybody wants to look that up. So what are the reasons you hear most often? I mean, you talked about this a little bit, but when a state or local agency says it doesn't have or doesn't want to give up information that you know or find out later that they have, what are the most common reasons you get that you hear no?
Well, there are a couple of reasons that I think are occurring with greater frequency. One of them is the use of the trade secrets exemption, which is all over the country. It's in the federal FOIA law too. And that allows private contractors, and there are many, I mean, there's been a huge amount of outsourcing of government function, also thanks to Ronald Reagan. It started really then. And so the government contractors often possess the information. This is actually going on with police videos. Axon, which is the company that made tasers, but they also do almost all the police videos. They possess the information. The government isn't holding it. And then these companies will say it's a trade, and this is not the case with the police videos, but other information in government contracts, they'll say, oh, it's proprietary, if we tell you how many people we employ, that's a proprietary piece of information that our competitors are going to be tipped off on. So trade secrets is huge. There are sometimes security and privacy issues. The investigative exemption is used a lot, where a government agency will say this is still under investigation, but of course investigations do not go on for 5 years, and usually, and so documents that are older should be available. But and then they want to charge you a lot of money for this stuff, and that's a big deterrent.
Yeah, so, I mean, these are some very specific reasons, and the trade secrets exemption is kind of fascinating because that could be used in a lot of different ways, whether we think it makes sense to apply it or not. Sometimes, though, it seems like, there's an individual who is saying no. What do you think about what motivates people to withhold information? Is it that they're protecting their job? Is it something that's decided on an individual level? Or is this about the culture of transparency in a particular agency or municipality? Are people following, what they perceive to be the rules, even though those might not actually comply what they know to be as the law?
So there's a fellow I know in Washington, Tom Sussman, who actually helped write the amendments to the Freedom of Information Act in the 70s, and he's still around. He worked for Teddy Kennedy at the time. He says the mindset is when in doubt, don't give it out. So, maybe this is a public record, maybe it isn't. I don't have anybody who can really advise me about that. In some states, you can be sued as a government employee if you give out information that you shouldn't give out. There's a big fear factor, I think. And then, of course, if you look at police agencies, the culture is, no, we're a paramilitary organization and we're going to keep it that way, and that means you cannot have the insight into what we're doing.
So these are some examples of when there are barriers and obstacles and people are saying no. Can you point to any places where the system for getting access to public records and information works really well? And then conversely, where have you run into the most obstacles? I mean, it sounds like police departments, but I don't know if there are other states or places that you can point to as great examples and not great examples.
I think it's very, it's erratic, even within a state, within a government. You can have government employees who really do want to be helpful. I mean, I'm married to a former government employee, so I'm not against government employees. But there are people who really do want to help. But I think it's very individualized. You can have helpful agencies in San Francisco and many that are not. I think places that have digitized their documents have a better chance of, just putting the information up online. I mean, a lot of this stuff, you shouldn't have to file a public records request for it. It should just be out there. Who are the contractors in San Francisco? Who has the contracts? I'd like to know those names, and I'd like to cross-check them with public finance and campaign finance reports.
Yeah, I feel like you're reading my questions upside down, because my next questions were about technology and our ability not only to scan documents but record meetings and frankly keep and record large quantities of information indefinitely if we want to. How does having this ability affect government's ability and willingness to provide access to information? I mean, it sounds like in some ways it can be helpful, and yet we don't see these tools always being used effectively.
Yeah. Well, I think that, around the country and probably within California too, smaller governments are not well funded. Legislatures don't necessarily fund their own state agencies very well. So, there is a bona fide issue that I have to acknowledge, even though it annoys me, which is that, this is not an inexpensive process, although it should be, given that we have all this technology, it should be better. I'll tell you that the email searches are very hard for government agencies when you're looking for keywords. They don't know who's got the emails. They don't know where it is. Is it on the main server? Is it on somebody's, laptop that has, for some reason, is not in the bigger server? Those are really hard issues, I think, for governments. But, the priority, if you ask the legislature, their priority is not to fund transparency. That, God forbid, it might redound to their disadvantage.
Yeah, you and I talked about this a little bit independently, and I'm going to ask you this question, and perhaps others in the audience will have thoughts on this as well, but what trends are you seeing in records retention policies? And given that it is so easy to store digital records, should we be trying to keep everything, or are there, reasons why it might make sense to clear certain things out at a certain time, or should, for, for the public interest, should we be trying to keep everything? And what concerns do you have about records retention?
So I think, that probably 5 years is a good measure for most records. I think law enforcement records have to be kept much longer and should be. A lot of it has to do with who has the server. Does the city own the server? Is it outsourced to some private contractor? What are they charging for it? I think those are all real considerations, but at least you have to go back 5 years. And if you're looking for trends or you're looking for patterns, maybe 10 years.
So can you talk a little bit about why civic engagement and public access matter on the local level, especially in the context of increasing national polarization?
So I think one of the biggest problems is that people don't trust government. They think government is hiding stuff. Governments, I think state and local in particular, can do a lot to be more open about what their process is, what they're doing, who they're working with, who the mayor's meeting with. What's the harm in that? And yet there's this sort of defensive crouch, I think, that happens in a lot of governments, and that there's a lot of fear. I'm a card-carrying member of the mainstream media, but there are issues that I think are legitimate where politicians really feel that, they're being hounded unnecessarily. And so I think the press has to be careful about what you go after and what you make a big issue about. But, I think there's really a lot of nexus between transparency and government and civic engagement and, keeping our democratic system democratic.
Yeah.
Small d.
I mean, you use the word harm. What harm occurs when state and local officials hold secret meetings when they're not supposed to?
Well, I'll give you an example. The data centers on the East Coast and actually around the country, but it's a huge issue on the East Coast right now. And Amazon and other, Microsoft and Google, they're all demanding non-disclosure agreements from local officials before they'll even come in there and say, hey, we want to locate here. And, what's the harm? Well, huge tracts of land are getting soaked up and used for these energy guzzling operations, and people have no say in that, and yet it affects their electric rates and their water rates and all kinds of things, and these are often presented as done deals. So, the public doesn't even have a chance to say, maybe I don't want this in my neighborhood.
Because they don't know about it.
We don't know what we don't know.
Yeah. So I said we're going to talk big picture, and let's start looking a little bit at California and the Bay Area. And I am going to talk about corruption scandals in a minute. The FBI has been very busy in San Francisco. But first, I want to talk about the laws that we have that support public access to information. So, as many of you know, we've got strong laws supporting public access here. On the state level, we have the California Public Records Act and the Brown Act, which ensures access to public meetings. And in San Francisco, we have the Sunshine Ordinance, which supports those and goes even further. Miranda, as you know, I am a member of the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force, and we hear complaints from people who say they weren't given public records they requested in a timely manner, or that there was a problem with the way a public meeting was noticed or run. I do feel a need to add a disclaimer here. I know very well that the vast majority of requests for public records in San Francisco are satisfied. And there are so many people who are working across agencies and departments who are diligent in complying with the ordinance and fulfilling requests. But the task force exists because response to requests isn't perfect. Sometimes there's human error in handling a request, or there's genuine miscommunication about what is being sought. And sometimes there's disagreement about what the California Public Records Act or Brown Act or Sunshine Ordinance require, and that's where things get interesting for us. So I have an example, and I'd love to hear your opinion about this. One trend that we've noticed at the task force is, and you actually referred to this a little bit when you were talking about the state secrets exemption, which may or may not apply here, but the city will have a contract with a third party to provide a service. The contract requires that the third party deliver certain kinds of reports to the city. When someone comes and asks the city for the report, they say, we don't have it. The vendor didn't give it to us. And yet the contract continues and the reports aren't turned over. What's going on here?
Well, I have to tell you, San Francisco is not unique in that. A lot of contractors hold on to documents that they shouldn't be holding on to, and of course that has to do with enforcement by the government, which is, okay, this is the term of the contract, you're supposed to do this report, and we're supposed to have it. So really, we don't have it is not an acceptable answer. The answer to the question should be, well, why don't you go get it? There was a case in LA that I could talk about a little bit. So the New Flyer bus company built buses for LA Metro, and they got the contract. It was a huge contract, millions and millions of dollars. They got the contract in part because they agreed to pay a livable wage and have certain benefits for local workers, et cetera, et cetera. And so a nonprofit went in and sued because they wanted to see if the bus company had complied with the contract, and LA Metro was ready to hand over the documents, and the bus company intervened and said, no, these are trade secrets, which is nuts. And, you know, it took a private organization to sue to get the documents, and then guess what? New Flyer was not complying with the terms of the contract. They weren't paying what they should have been paying, they weren't doing the benefits. And I'm like, okay, the government was supposed to enforce this contract. And that's unfortunately very common, and you know, again, it's an outgrowth of outsourcing. I mean, I don't expect a city to build its own buses, I have to say that, but you could do your own trash collection, you could hire the school bus drivers, there's a lot you could do.
Or at the very least enforce the contracts that you've signed with these vendors to make them comply with what you've asked for in the first place.
Right. Very common.
So, let's talk about corruption. You and I, we were reviewing some of the local corruption cases here, which, according to the San Francisco Chronicles tally, have involved more than 20 city officials and business representatives. And I also want to, I don't know if there's anyone here from Mission Local, but I will give a shout out to them for their excellent interactive graphic that shows how all those players are interconnected. So there are all the people who have been tried and sentenced for embezzling money and accepting bribes, among other crimes, including Mohammed Nuru, former director of the Department of Public Works, Rodrigo Santos, a prolific structural engineer who had a knack for getting projects greenlighted, and Harlan Kelly, the former head of the Public Utilities Commission. And these are just a few of the high-profile ones. There's a much longer list. I know you know, we're also looking at corruption cases in San Jose and Oakland. You know, of this proliferation of cases in the Bay Area, which ones caught your attention, and how did these people get away with what they were doing for so long?
I mean, how did they get away with it? I mean, you know, this is where actually an informed public and an engaged public putting pressure on government is really, really important. But you know, I was actually struck, I mean, I'm certainly struck by the San Francisco stuff, and it's pretty wild, and, you know, who knows I mean, it's probably, as the cliche goes, it's probably just the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, it's got to go much further, because if all these people knew, then other people knew too. But I was interested in San Jose too, because you had two different mayors, both of whom have failed to comply either with Public Records Act requirements or open meetings, and you know, using a private email account, that kind of thing, or not, you know, text messaging that remains private. And then the current mayor has these sort of task force groups that are meeting in private to advise him. I'm like, and they include other elected officials. I'm like, that can't stand. You know, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. You know, when you talk about the mayor or people at the top doing this, you can see how it can trickle down, and others think, well, you know, it's okay for me to do this. I mean, what do you think local governments could or should be doing in terms of increasing transparency that would prevent or discourage elected officials or employees from being tempted to get involved in whether it's a direct corruption scheme or just doing things behind closed doors that should be happen out in the open?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's really basic stuff. You know, it's having public notice of meetings, having documents available that are discussed at the meetings, having items online, having Zoom meetings of all these public bodies, which actually in that regard, the pandemic helped us a little bit because, but you know, a lot of those meetings were not recorded. It was on Zoom, but it was gone. You know, I just think we ought to make better use of the technology. The government should make better use of the technology, you know, and it needs to be paid for. But I think ultimately it's a cost-saving measure too. If you don't have to answer the same public records request over and over for the same information, that should be saving money.
Yeah. You know, and you mentioned, you sort of alluded to this earlier, but I know that a lot of the reporting you've done isn't even about explicit corruption. It's just about government agencies keeping their work out of public view and the problems that that can cause. I'd like to point to the reporting that Seth Rosenfeld, who is here tonight, I don't know where you are, Seth, but did a few years ago for the, yay! So I'd like to point to the reporting that Seth Rosenfeld did a few years ago for the public press on the California Public Utilities Commission, and the way it was accepting safety reports submitted by ride-hailing companies like Uber and Lyft, and then keeping the reports secret. What was so fascinating about Seth's reporting was that it showed that the companies were complying with the state regulation. Seth got to the bottom of things when he found an obscure footnote in a regulatory document in which the California Public Utilities Commission promised to hold the safety reports secret, not only from the general public, but also from other government agencies. Because Seth put a spotlight on this issue, the CPUC was pressured to change its policy, but how often do you see cases where everything is being done totally legally, but is still problematic due to lack of transparency? And who can we count on to push back when there's not somebody like Seth doing that reporting?
We need more local news organizations like this one and the many others that are in the Bay Area. You guys are actually pretty lucky compared to the rest of the country, and you know, should be supporting all of these organizations, because I think that's really the future of local journalism. You know, another thing about Seth's work was that when the Public Utilities Commission made some changes and, you know, made some more demands of the companies, they kept that secret too. It's like, okay. So, and you know, it's sort of the same thing as this case in LA in the bus company, which is the public agency should be enforcing this. And it should just be routine that this stuff is public. I mean, if they are making the reports, why aren't they published?
Right. It's a great question. You know, and it's funny, a lot of the challenges for understanding what's happening in local government are much more mundane. You know, it's just somebody wanting to understand, you know, why are they digging up the streets on my block? Why is this happening? But sometimes a question that starts out as a small issue for one individual or neighborhood turns out to be, you know, just the beginning of much larger issues or systemic problems. And so when community members and journalists run into obstacles in getting access to the information they need to hold government accountable, that's a problem. So from your perspective, what could be done differently? What kinds of policies would increase access to information? And you know, we talk about, you know, what about the possibility of reducing both the cost for producing records and burdens on staff? Like, what could governments, local and state governments, be doing that would make things easier for journalists and members of the public and less costly and burdensome to their own agencies?
Well, one thing I think members of the public have to do is be very, very explicit in their requests. You know, you can't ask for all the emails from January 1st to December 1st that mentioned, you know, I don't know what, mentioned the bus system or something. It's got to be very, very specific so that they can't say to you, this is not something we can do. I think this notion, as they call it in the open government business, proactive disclosure. I mean, governments, most governments, except in the smaller places, really do, you know, everything's online now. You have to, if you apply for a permit, you've created a document that is online and accessible. You know, all kinds of data like that are already there. So why not, you know, pick out what are the most important things that a community wants to know? You certainly want to know who's getting the contracts. You would like to know about building permits. You would like to know about road improvements and plans to build sidewalks or, that kind of stuff. Why not have maps that show where this work is being done? It's not that hard, but it takes a mindset, and I think it has to be argued, and I think it can be argued that ultimately it's a cost-saving measure for government.
To put it out there.
Yeah.
I think about all of the reporters that Noah mentioned, and I talked about Seth and Vijay Sundaram, who's done a lot of reporting for us on family courts in California, is also here. And, and actually I'm thinking about a problem Madison encountered where she requested some data sets and she said, I want them in Excel, and I understand that you're gonna have to redact certain columns. What do? They gave her everything in PDFs, which just makes it so much harder to analyze. They existed originally in Excel, and it's just,
Well, and that actually, in most states, that would be actually breaking the rules because they're not supposed to create new documents when, if they don't have the document, they don't give it to you, but they're not, so that's,
right,
that's just a deliberate effort to mess with people.
So here's a question, and this is something that feels like it's popping up in the news everywhere else. Can AI help, or is it going to cause more problems?
All of the above. It could help. Certainly it could help with searching. It can help with certain kinds of labeling, I think, and it's also fraught with risk right now. I think it's both. And I don't think anybody has a handle on that yet.
Yeah. So what advice do you have for people who want to try doing this on their own? Whether they're, journalists at small organizations or freelancers or just members of the public who want more information about things that are happening in their community.
Yeah. So one piece of advice that I gave to young reporters when I was an editor at the Post, and this just blew them away, was I said, go in person. Go in person to that agency. Go meet the person behind the counter who has access to what you need and who also understands how the material is organized. Mm-hmm. And I would tell any member of the public that if at all possible, go in person, get on the phone. I know this is all very old-fashioned, but it's really effective. So start with that, and just ask for stuff. You don't have to. You should not have to file a public records request for everything that should be publicly available, even if it isn't posted online. So I really think building relationships with, the people who have access to the information, whether it's the clerk at, of the court or the person at the development or the planning agency, whatever. Get to know them in a non-hostile environment. And if you're a reporter, you should be making these rounds just to chat people up and, if possible, have coffee with them or whatever, but not because you need something at the moment. You will in the future, but, building those relationships, obviously for a member of the public too, I think that's number one. The other thing is a system of triangulation that I would suggest, which is if one agency turns you down, figure out what other agencies had to have this information too. If it's a road issue or a traffic issue or a planning issue, it's more than one agency has that information, it's a state environmental issue, but there's also a local environmental agency. Ask them all for it. And often, that really is effective, where one organization, one agency will turn me down, but then it's usually the federal government has it all, actually. And that was true in this, in one of the communities in my book in Alabama, which is really a nightmare to deal with. They don't have any deadlines for responding to public records requests. But then it turned out the federal U.S. Department of Agriculture had almost everything I was looking for. Although somebody else had to sue to get it, but we did get it.
Well, thank you. This is all very helpful, and I know you'll be around if people have specific. Well, and we're going to have the Q&A. I have one more question for you before I'm going to invite Lisa Rudman, who spoke at the beginning, our development director, to say a few words, and then we will transition to audience Q&A. And I'm going to ask Noah to sort of manage the microphone even. So if you have a question, you can start lining up this way. Lisa's going to speak first, but you can start lining up. And while Lisa is coming to the microphone, Miranda, I'm going to ask you, what are your thoughts about the future of journalism, nationally and at the local level? I know we could do a whole separate session on this, but because I've got you here, I didn't want to waste the moment and not ask.
Well, my whole career has actually been in local news, even though that I worked for a national news organization that has become more national and international and not very interested in local news anymore. anymore. That is the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos' Washington Post. I think the future of journalism, and thus the future of democracy, which is really the nexus here, is in organizations like this one. And in California, actually, from my perspective, as somebody who lives in Maryland, you're doing pretty well in terms of having a lot of different local news organizations. And you have to pay for it. The philanthropy has been supporting this stuff for years, but you have to have a subscription model, and people have to be willing to pay for it, I think. And I think it's crucial. But I also, I'm heartened when I see what's going on out here. But then I'm in Alabama, which is one of the most depressing places I've ever been, and it's a terrible situation there.
In terms of lack of
local news, and when you don't have local news and people don't understand what's going on in their communities, they become passive, disengaged, and angry. And so, I have a lot of hope for local nonprofit news organizations.
I love hearing that. So, Lisa, we're gonna hand things off to you, and then we'll do our audience Q&A.
I'm going to start this going around. And hi, my name is Lisa Rudman. I work with the San Francisco Public Press. It's really great to see you all here in person. It really is a delight, so thank you for being here. I want to tell you that there's a sign on the wall in our office up on the 5th floor. It's over by Lila's desk. And it just asks a question. It says, are you in? And that's my question to you all. Are you in for being part of independent, investigative, in-depth, what else do I have? Intrepid. And will you make an investment in our work? We have a basket going around. Also, Madison's passing out these little green QR codes, and it's very easy to make a donation online. Now, I know a lot of you bought tickets for tonight, and thank you so much. We really appreciate that. We're also asking for you to make a donation because we're celebrating our 15th anniversary this year for the San Francisco Public Press. Yes. And it's the 5th anniversary of our radio station, KSFP 102.5 FM. And along with that, our podcast, Civic. So with the 15 and the 5, there's lots of numbers you can pick from. In fact, we would really encourage you to think about multiples of 15 to help us celebrate our 15th anniversary. And I think even if we were to make some inroads in the kind of opacity and lack of transparency on local and state level, even if our wildest dreams of the new society that had openness and engagement with people, I think we still would need local news, and we still would need maybe 15 more years of the San Francisco Public Press. So I'm inviting you, I'm asking you, are you in? Are you in for this next phase? We have Lila LaHood, who's now our executive director, and Michael Stoll, you may have heard, has actually, gone back to his dream of going back to reporting. So Michael's still with the organization. We've got incredible, you heard Noah speaking earlier about the reporters that we're working with. So if you go to our website, if you check us out more, if you've known us for years, like many of you have, we really think this is the time. Literally, it's a historic time, but it's a time in our organization that we need to come together, and we're asking for if you are in. I wanted to also mention when Noah was talking about the upcoming work, stay tuned, of course, stay tuned for our local election guide and our local election coverage. Now, we don't need to cover the horse race. We don't even need to cover the candidates. A lot of our colleagues at the other great sistren organizations locally do that. What we're going to do is what we always do. We're going to take the things that are our deep beats, and we're going to, frame those and look at those through the election moment, through what the politicians are saying, or better yet, through what the politicians are doing, not just what they're saying. So if you really want some unique and specific coverage, particularly on the measures, we're going to drill deep on the measures. We're going to work with our partners at KLW, who I hope are going to air this taping, by the way. this audio recording. KLW is going to team up with us again. We're going to do some pre-election live events that I hope you all will come out to. And just stay tuned for some of our work about the local work that we actually can have some influence on very concretely here locally. So that's a little stay tuned. I hope these little green pieces of paper are going around. If the QR code doesn't work, like happened to my friend Terry here, you can just go to our website. There's a big donate button. So our website is probably written all over the place.
sfpublicpress.org. Oh, my microphone's not on.
No, I was going to say it. sfpublicpress.org. And you'll find us. And please, it's easy to donate. We made the donation system a lot easier. So speaking of generosity, and thank you. Thank you again for considering being in with us. I really want to acknowledge and thank Miranda Spivack for all of your work. Your journalism over the years, but the fact that you basically donated your time and effort to come here and throw down for us is really amazing. We appreciate that. And once again, Lila LaHood was a great talk show host, so thank you, Lila, and back to you.
Okay, so I think we have some people lining up, and while they're coming up to the microphone and while Lisa and Noah are getting that adjusted, there are a couple more people I want to thank. Rick Nee is one of our intrepid copy editors who's in the audience, and we also have Patricia Bovin Campbell and Peter Shear, who are two of our board members. And if anybody else is here who I should be naming and you haven't identified yourself, forgive me, or just come up and grab the mic from me. I also want to thank all of our members and supporters, people who have been supporting us for years. So I see so many faces out in the audience tonight, new friends, old friends. I'm waving at people. And I'm just delighted that you're all here. And now, Noah, I'm going to hand it off to you to manage our questions.
All right. Do I have a mic yet? My mic's live. Come on in. Thank you for hosting. I appreciate it. I actually live down the street from here, so it's an easy walk. My name is Shram Shariati. I'm actually running for mayor of San Francisco. And so I'm a government employee. I can relate to everything you just said. But one of my questions is, how do we hold the media accountable? So for example, I am running for mayor, right? There's 13 people on the ballot now, but the media says 5. Why are they not talking about the other people? Also, when the polls come out, they say these are the people in the polls. I contact the companies that do the polls. My name's not in the polls. The other candidates, their names are on the polls. So how do we show transparency to the elections when the other media is not reporting the truth, the complete truth?
Are you getting coverage anywhere?
It took me 7 months, and Erica Sandberg from the San Francisco Bee gave me my first start. I very appreciated that. But it took me 7 months, and I contacted every local paper I could think of. I went to LinkedIn, contacted 50 journalists, nothing.
I don't have an easy answer for you. I think you're up against the media industrial complex in some ways. It's always hard when there are multiple candidates. I mean, that's a big group. I would just encourage you to keep pushing as hard as you can and, find a way. I don't know whether you have a blog or some other way of communicating with people, but, the media itself often says the way to get change is public shaming. Try that method if you're feeling like you've been unjustly left off.
Thanks for your question. We're glad you're here this evening.
My name is Brian Donahue, and my question is similar to the previous questioner. I live in a tiny town in the Bay Area, and I'm the editor of an even tinier little news source. The town is Emeryville, and the news source is the Emeryville Tattler. It's a tiny little thing. I don't make any money on it. I just do it in my spare time. I've been doing it for 15 years. It's me and one other person that writes for it. But the question is, a couple years ago I uncovered a major story, and that was there was a toxic waste cleanup site in Emeryville, and the DTSC, the Department of Toxic Controlled Substances, was in charge of the cleanup. But I got a tip, and I followed the tip, and then I found out that the project manager talked to me and said that the DTSC was in cahoots with the developer, so it was regulatory capture. And he talk with me at length, and then he went and then he applied for a whistleblower status and received it from the federal government. He's a project manager at DTSC. So I did the story of the regulatory capture about how the developer and the DTSC are in cahoots, and the city of Emeryville has dropped the ball. So I did the story, pushed it off to the local press. Nobody picked it up. And I think the reason is because I'm so tiny that there's no credibility. So how could such a tiny little news organization uncover something so big? And I think that they thought, well, it's not really possible. So I pushed out to all the local media, no one picked it up. Do you have any suggestions on how to rectify that situation? Thank you.
Wow. So how do you get the word out when you do publish stuff?
I'm sorry, I just have a little it's a blog-like thing. It's
Yeah,
called the Emeryville Tablet. There's no advertising.
Yeah.
I don't take money. I have a pretty good readership for the city of Emeryville, but it's tiny.
So a lot of the people who I'm writing about in my book, who are not journalists but had need to call attention to issues of great importance, one of them in particular comes to mind was a woman in Worcester, Mass, who uncovered the fact that there was PFOA in turnout gear for firefighters, which has now caught on nationally. But she spent like 8 years. But she used Facebook, I gotta tell you, very effectively as a way to contact people, to put the word out, etc. It sort of surprised me because, in the East Coast media, we're way past Facebook, and no kid I know uses Facebook and all that. But, I would think about Facebook, Instagram, whatever, and, sometimes somebody will see it and could be interested, and that your direct approach, for whatever reasons, didn't work.
Are you aware of that culture? Are you aware of that culture whereby if it's too tiny,
I guess I'm surprised if it were an environmental issue that nobody followed up on it. Uh-oh, I went to elementary school with this guy. He's gonna power me.
Hi, Randy.
Oh, God.
How you been? As you know, my name is Peter Byrne. I'm an investigative reporter locally. And I want to bring it back to public records. Great presentation. And it's great to see all these people that are public records freaks in this room. It's really heartening. So I've been doing public records requests for like 30 some odd years, and is it my imagination or is the federal government getting less responsive? And what does that have to do with exemption number 5, otherwise known as deliberative process?
I think all governments are getting less responsive. I have had a pending request with the Department of Agriculture for 3 years. That's way, way past anything that should be allowed. And, I don't have the legal bandwidth right now to go to court, which is what I would need to do. Certainly larger news organizations do, but I think it is getting worse, and I think it was bad under Trump, and I don't think it really got any better under Biden, and I'm not exactly sure why. And the deliberative exemption, I don't know if people know what that is, but that's saying that these are documents that are used to pre-decisional, as they say, I can't tell you if that's being used more or not. The Department of Justice, though, does an annual report on FOIA response times, Freedom of Information Act response times, and you can see which agencies are just generally the worst. And interestingly enough, the Department of Agriculture, who knew, is one of the worst. So, I can't really answer that any more specifically.
I think you did bring up an important point that short of a lawsuit, they can stonewall people forever.
Well, and that's true in California too. Not in San Francisco apparently, but if you are trying to get a state record and you don't succeed, your only recourse is to go to court. And that's the end of it for most people.
Actually, under the California Public Records Act, you're allowed to go to the actual office and ask to see the records, which I've used successfully several times. Thank you.
So that echoes what you said earlier, show up in person.
Yeah, true.
But I wanted to ask about a different take, which is campaign finance databases, because I sort of thought we were going to talk maybe about those kinds of backroom deals. There was one called MapLight, Money and Politics, based out of the city I live in, Berkeley. But now they are a consultant to governments, and there's another website called opensecrets.org, which has been helpful. I'm trying to track down, document the work of the California Association of Realtors and their 100 years of shenanigans, putting so much money into anti-tenant, for example. So the question was, do you work with those? What do you think of those? And where should I be going? Because I don't know the best sources for campaign finance. I kind of need that interface.
Yeah, I mean,
Thanks.
So certainly in the federal level, I think actually the Federal Election Commission database is pretty good. The Federal Election Commission is completely paralyzed these days, but their data collection is still pretty good. You know, state by state, I mean, I haven't had any experience with the California state databases, but where I am in Maryland, it's a pretty good state database, and you know, you can get a lot of information about candidates, about donors, about PACs that are giving. You know, I mean, I find the public databases are actually pretty reliable. I don't know if that's not been your experience.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Jerome Kerner. Recently moved to San Francisco from New York, a retired architect. And I think one of the issues that we're not discussing here tonight, although it was alluded to in terms of nepotism, backroom deals, etc., is the concept of going from I to we. And when our government employees perhaps are underpaid, perhaps they feel that they're not getting enough, and they're big budgets, and they're earning very little, let's say, and they feel they deserve to get some of the cream off the top. And if that happens, of course, they're not confronting the contractor who's giving them that bonus, let's say, or the family member, the nepotism that occurs. So the question is all around integrity. We find that gift giving, even at the highest levels, at the Supreme Court, which I'm sure shocked everybody here, and that wasn't detected until good reporting made that possible. And so we don't know what's going on down at the precincts and I've seen it happen in the building department, where I went to a department and sat and waited for an approval, and I saw contractors go behind the desk of the reviewer and slip something in the drawer, and their file got pulled out before mine. So, you know, it's a question of integrity and the concept of going from I to we, and how can we then perhaps put conditions or find out who is prepared to serve us as their constituents, as the we.
You know, it's a great question. I'm not sure I have a simple answer for you. I will say, I think you hit on a very important sector where there is a lot of opportunity for graft and corruption, and that is not just San Francisco.
These are all great questions. Thank you, everybody who's stepping up.
Quick question. You caught my attention when you said suing government for negligence has become easier.
Yeah.
Having sued the city and county of San Francisco, they pretty much, they blow you off. They blew me off until I filed a lawsuit.
Yeah.
And then they actually start paying attention to you. Can you just give us a couple of minutes on the negligent angle in suing government?
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking of is that, you know, the whole concept of sovereign immunity, and I know there are lawyers in the audience who could probably answer this better than I can, but that has diminished in the United States, and so that is what I meant when I was saying it was easier now to sue the government than maybe it was 20 years ago. On the other hand, every state, I think, has a Tort Claims Act, and so that makes government very nervous because, you know, they can be sued for negligence that way too. So it's not, that's really all I meant. I mean, certainly the act of filing a lawsuit is a big deal and expensive.
You mentioned an example earlier of some documents that are being returned as like a PDF instead of an Excel spreadsheet. And that got me thinking about like the importance of processable formats to things like creating visualizations and maps and, you know, graphing historical trends and things like that. So are you aware of any, you know, efforts to promote the use of open or at least processable formats versus like a static scan that you can't do anything with? And if so, how are those going?
You know, I can't cite chapter and verse for you. I know that there are some nonprofits that are actually working around the country with state and local governments to help them do exactly what you're talking about. And beyond that, I really don't have a lot of information about how it's going. It's certainly a laudable effort and something that, you know, you can pressure your government to get engaged with.
Got a legal question. Is there an equivalent local government to the federal government's use of official use only in different categories under that?
I'm not sure I understood that.
Could you state a little more about what you're looking for? What do you mean by official use only?
So official use only documents are exempt from FOIA requests. I'm wondering if there's an equivalent in local or state government.
You know, that's going to vary, I guess, state by state. I haven't really seen that written into FOIA laws around the country, but it may be there. You know, there are lots and lots of exemptions, and they are not all put in one place. So if you look up your law, either state or municipal or whatever, the exemptions are not all going to pop up there because they may be a real estate related exemption or some other kind of exemption. So it's hard to generalize about that. Sorry.
Thank you so much for being here. I have a question that alludes to your comment about Alabama and maybe being a news desert. I've been in San Francisco for 10 years, but I grew up in a small town in Virginia. And when I was back in April, I saw that my local newspaper had a for sale sign out front. So my question to you is, if you were to go to a place like Alabama or maybe a small town like mine and you wanted to create one of those newsrooms of the future that's nonprofit, investigative, what things would you need? Is it people? Is it technology?
Yeah.
What are the ingredients?
Yeah. I grew up in Virginia. What's the town?
Franklin County.
Okay. You know, Lila, you might be better able to answer that in some ways as somebody who's right in the nonprofit news world.
Well, I was going to say, I'd be happy to chat with you. There are a lot of great organizations that could support an initiative, whether it's you or a coalition of friends or community members who might want to buy that publication. There's the Institute for Nonprofit News. There's also Lion, which is local independent online news publishers. And they've got a lot of resources and information from people who have already gone through this process and who are very generous with their knowledge. I'd be happy to talk with you. I'd be happy to introduce you to some of these people who might be able to help you. And you know, it's interesting, the amount of philanthropy for the nonprofit news space has grown quite a bit, and some of it is very much earmarked for startups in news deserts. So there may be some clear opportunities for you to take advantage of.
Can I address police corruption?
If you could speak directly into the microphone, yes.
Can we address police corruption? Like he was talking about San Francisco corruption. I mean, they changed the facts that I can't find things that I filed before. They changed the addresses. I mean, the last time I went to 911 4 times, and I don't know what that police department, they probably changed the address so it can't be found. What can we do about that?
Is that?
Excuse me, it's just like suing the police department.
Yeah. Is that in the city of San Francisco or?
Yeah, Tenderloin and Church Street.
You know, I would go to your county or your local supervisor, possibly for help.
No, but have you heard of police cover-ups?
Yes.
So I know is that the end of the line for questions?
No.
Oh, Noah has a question.
I think it's fair to say that we all care about government transparency and secrecy. You know, we get paid to care. I don't know why these people are here, but I love it. How much do you think everybody cares? How much do you think the general population, in whether it's in a city like San Francisco, or a state like California, you know, how important do you think this is to most people?
So my experience is that people don't even know what their rights are for public information until they hit a problem. And then they go to the school board, or they go to the supervisors, or they go to the planning department, and that's where they hit the information blockade, and then they start to care. I mean, it's sort of like when I was an editor of a small chain of local newspapers in the Washington area before I went to the Post, and I knew that school coverage would be really important once people had kids in the schools. They didn't care. They were paying taxes, but they didn't really care about the schools until they had a personal stake in it. And I think, unfortunately, that's sort of how it happens, is, you know, people stumble into a problem and then they care deeply, and they realize how messed up the systems are.
And they probably feel very alone.
They do, and actually they shouldn't. And I'm hoping my book will be helpful in giving people a roadmap for how to fight some of this.
So Miranda,
Miranda.
I'm really, really looking forward to this book, and again, it's nice to be on your pre-publication tour. But I wonder if there's a couple more examples. I think that the subtitle of the book about backroom deals and democracy, and then you have and people that are fighting back.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if there's a couple more examples, because I think we need all the hopium we can get and all the inspiration, and just any more examples about your book and the people in it.
Yeah, thanks. So a lot of what unites these 5 different people in the book is that they bump into situations where somehow their community is getting passed over for the benefit of a big corporation. It's sewers, believe it or not. There's a sewer story in my book, which is the classic suburban or American local journalism story, actually, is water and sewer, and who gets it and who has to pay for it. And I think that those kinds of experiences for people are really, they're just sort of devastating, and they learn what really I like about all these people, and they've been extremely generous with their time with me, because this has gone on for about 4 years of research, is that they learned by doing, and they also learned how to network, which, honestly, I can't tell you how important Facebook has been to most of these people. It's really fascinating to me, because, we're all we're in the post-Facebook era, right? We think, but we're not. And so, there's a guy in the book who was in prison in New York State, involved with murder, so not a great thing, but he had a clean record for 10 years, and he got put up for parole early, and then an algorithm did him in a system that's used by parole agencies all over the country that use data, but it may have flawed data, that is supposed to decide parole. Even the parole board in New York didn't know how the system worked. And when he went to try to find out, guess what? He had trade secrets, and he never was able to find out. And that's actually, that kind of issue is very big in the criminal justice system, because there's so much automated stuff being used to develop sentences, to set parole, to set bail, whatever. And it's all being algorithm based, which is really pretty dangerous now. Predictive policing, there's a study out of Oakland, actually, where, there was an organization there that determined that all the past history in Oakland was being used for predictive policing now, but it was targeting low-income minority neighborhoods, and so it was perpetuating this problem. Those are some of the other examples that I've thought about, and I've written about, but it's really, the thing that I think unifies these people is A, they learned how to do this with no help, and B, they've built networks around the country, and they learned from other people around the country and were able to share their information and get information, because ultimately there's only about 5 or 6 problems that happen in communities, you know. It's water, sewer, schools, roads, you name it, and to one degree or another, and real estate and development. And to one degree or another, these are all experiences that are shared by people around the country. So, but the idea that, you know, big companies or companies are benefiting often to the detriment of communities is a recurring theme that I've been looking at in this big part of the book.
Miranda, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This has been great. Audience, to our volunteers who help us set up. Miranda will be around for a little bit. If you have a question you'd like to ask her directly, come talk to me or anyone from the public press. And please enjoy food and drinks on your way out. But more than anything, talk to us, talk to each other, and thank you again for being here. Good night.